I'm Meghla Ramesh again. The next session is about overcoming challenges when taking your logic app into production by Stephen Thomas. Stephen Thomas is an independent consultant specializing in BizTalk Server and other Microsoft Server integration technologies, including Windows Azure and WCF. He is recognized as an MVP for past 13 years. He has worked on many BizTalk projects all over the world, with many clients being in the Fortune 500 companies. He runs the BizTalk community site, biztalkgurus.com. He has presented at several Microsoft TechEd events, multiple service-oriented architecture conferences, and various user groups. Stage is over to you, Thomas. Thank you.
As she said, my name is Stephen Thomas, and this is my fourth Integrate conference to be presenting at. For the half of you that were here last year, welcome back. For the other half of you, you're kind of the lucky ones. You missed my session last year on Azure virtual machines. I tried really hard to make virtual machines fun and exciting, but apparently at 8:30 in the morning, I'm not sure that came across as well as it should. So today I'm here talking about something totally different. I'm talking about overcoming challenges when taking your logic apps into production. So here's some contact information for me. You can reach out to me anytime. Email address is simple. It's steven@stephenwthomas.com, and you can also follow me on Twitter. So before I jump into my session, I have a couple things to cover here. For those of you that didn't make it to a global Azure integration bootcamp that they put on a couple months ago, I have my lab available for download. Just go to my website /labs. And in this lab, I walk you through step-by-step, creating a function and a logic app that calls that function. And then we use sentiment analysis to look at emails and determine the sentiment of the emails coming in. So the lab end-to-end takes about 60 minutes. And like I said, it's step-by-step. It's about 20 pages. So if you're new to functions and logic apps, this is a great resource for you to start getting hands-on right away. I'm also excited to announce that I'm finally done with my Pluralsight course on BizTalk Server administration with BizTalk 360. This course has been in the works for quite a while. It's about a 3-hour course that walks you through all the features of BizTalk 360, kind of contrasts and compares them to what's out of the box with BizTalk Server, and kind of shows you how to set up some of the new features inside of BizTalk 360 as well. So with that, let's jump into what we're going to talk about in this session. First off, I broke it up into 3 phases. The first phase is kind of the decision phase, when we're kind of analyzing what's the best technology to use to solve our problem. Then we have the wrong and right phase. This is where we look back at what we did and look at what we did right, what we did wrong, and how we can make improvements on that. And last, we have the tips segment. In this phase, we look at some tips that I sure wish I knew before I went out and tried to build my first production logic app. So phase 1, decisions. You won't look like this making these kind of decisions, but anyway, so my client scenario, this client currently does not have BizTalk Server running. They have a very small IT staff. In fact, I spent most of my time working directly with the CTO. They only have about 3 additional developer resources on top of that. One of them was a contractor who has now already left, so they're a really small IT shop. They landed a new 2-year contract where they required them to send EDI transactions in order to get paid for the work that they were doing for this vendor. They had no experience with EDI files or working with flat file data. They also, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, they got very poor integration requirements from their vendor. This vendor is a Fortune 500 vendor, but the integration requirements were very poor. Plus, they're very old. A lot of things were dated in 1999. Latency was not an issue since we were dealing with a EDI and flat file-based batch process. We could deal with some latency, such as latency you might see in a serverless platform versus latency you can get through BizTalk Server. And all the data that we were needing to send via EDI and flat file lives in SQL Azure. So the integration part of this solution was just a smaller piece of an overall project. The overall project lasted 6 months. I was involved with other areas besides integration, but now let's take a look at how we went and solved their integration needs. So first off, let's step back for a second and talk about integration accounts. I know Jeff had a whole session on this yesterday, but just to recap, it has BizTalk-like features to logic apps. It has support for EDI and flat file. And the current cost for integration account is $1,000 per month per account. Now, there are less expensive developer editions available for dev and test. So has anybody here looked at integration accounts and decided not to go with them due to cost? A couple people. Is there anybody that was unaware that they cost $1,000 a month? So a couple people. So let's continue talking about integration accounts. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. So our integration account's worth the price. So let's take a look. So if our client would have went with a BizTalk-based solution, they would have had lack of skills and resources to actually implement that solution. With such a small IT staff, it's going to be very hard for them to pick up and learn BizTalk Server. BizTalk Server tends to be expensive and has a large upfront expense for licensing. So even if they could build it out with a standard edition, you're still looking at an expensive initial investment to get BizTalk up and running. They also have server setup that they would have to do on top of the BizTalk development. So then we looked at a custom .NET parser. In this solution, they did have resources available that know .NET, so they'd be able to build that out. These would be hosted in Azure as either an API app or Azure Functions. And we went through and did some estimations about what we think it would cost to build out an intense EDI and flat file solution using .NET. Now, there's more to it than just building a parsing engine. You have to build kind of an underlying mini platform. You have to be able to track your ISA header values. You need to be able to have your partner information that's configurable. So there's more to it than just .NET file parsing. So our total estimate came up to 160 days to build 4 inbound files and 2 outbound files. We assigned some dollar values to that and then figured 25% maintenance over 2 years, and that came up to $25,000. So now we looked at logic apps with the integration accounts. They had skilled resources available since I was on the project. Part of my role was to transition my knowledge to the team when I leave. We did an estimate on that using the same files, and quite literally we came up with 15 days to build this out in logic apps. That's because we have a lot less testing because there's no custom pieces. We don't have to build out any platform infrastructure. We don't have to build out any EDI components. That's all there for us in the integration accounts. So we look at a cost of $2,000 to build it out. Now, over 24 months, adding 25% maintenance and adding in our integration accounts, we came up to $26,500. So I think the title of my course kind of gives it away which way they went. Of course, they went the logic app route. But now let's take a little bit closer look at why they went that way. So first off, the .NET way was the chicken way. So I think we all agree that sure, it could be done in .NET, but there's a lot missing in terms of functionality from a platform perspective. So the pricing, so in all fairness, the pricing of integration accounts was not released to us before we started doing our development using the integration accounts. So by the time we got the pricing for it, we'd already built out 2 of the files in the logic apps. Now, it wasn't a whole lot of time and effort in that, but we were up against a tight timeline. I started the project at the beginning of November, and we had to go live January 1st, or we weren't going to get paid for the work that we were doing. Another part of this is the client is planning to leverage logic apps in other areas of their infrastructure or their enterprise. So the serverless platform was going to help move them forward down that path. Then on May 1st, our decision to use logic apps was completely validated. On May 1st, every single schema that we send to our client has changed. They recently merged with another company, and they told us it was going to be seamless cutover between the 2 systems, but in fact, absolutely every single schema changed. So, can anybody guess how long it took us to update every single schema, every single map, and redeploy to production with logic apps? It took us 2 days. That was how long it took us to get fully functional again after what is a catastrophic change in requirements. Now, if we would have went the custom.NET route, it would have been significantly more than 2 days because we would have had to retest all of that custom code and logic that we built. So now what if you're an existing BizTalk customer? So it definitely would have been a harder decision if you were already running BizTalk Server. So if you were a BizTalk customer and already using EDI, I think the best decision would have been to keep using EDI with your BizTalk system. Even though you had to pull your data down from the cloud, already having that infrastructure set up for EDI and BizTalk would have been a huge benefit. Now, if you were an existing BizTalk customer and didn't have EDI set up, it's not really as straightforward as it sounds. There's more to it, plus setting up parties and all the EDI schemas, that it still might make sense to go with the integration accounts at the premium price in order to leverage the functionality of the logic apps. Now, if you're an existing BizTalk customer, and Richard said this earlier, there's no with or without integration accounts, you should definitely be looking at logic apps for all new development. The serverless platform really is just that nice, and for connecting your cloud endpoints, it can't be beat. So that moves us into phase 2, what we did wrong and right. So the first thing we realized when working with logic apps is we kind of have to rethink our approach to architecture. And what do I mean by that? Well, now we have to make design decisions around the rules of our serverless platform. So we understood our rules of BizTalk Server pretty good. They were pretty lax. We could kind of do what we want. But now whatever we build has to run on somebody else's platform, so we have to follow their rules. Furthermore, we now have to factor in the cost of what we're doing in their environment. Now, the cost per action for logic apps is extremely low. It's a fraction of a penny per action. But for example, in BizTalk Server, I might break expression shapes up into multiple expressions just so I could name them differently and have better readable orchestrations. If I do that kind of thing in logic apps, well, there's a cost associated with that. So that's something we now need to factor in when we're architecting our overall solution. Now, the logic apps have a fantastic release cadence. Right now, it's about every 2 weeks, and that's fantastic. But what that caused us to do was to constantly rethink our approach every time they did a release. And on top of that, we had to stay on top of their releases to make sure they didn't release some sort of functionality that went against what we were already building and deploying. And there were a few instances where they made changes to what they were, the features that we were utilizing that did impact the way we're developing. So for example, the for each loops used to have a limit of 1,000 iterations, and we had a workaround for that. And then nested for each loops were currently back then not supported. They are now, but that was something else that we worked around. But now we had to rethink, well, should we pick up the new functionality or should we keep our workaround in place? We also looked at the way we set up our subscriptions. We used a total of 2 subscriptions. We used a total of 2 subscriptions, but we crossed to 2 different regions. So what this meant is our dev and UAT environments were both in the same subscription, different regions, and our production was in a different subscription, but the same region as our dev. So what we used to deploy across regions was a Visual Studio deployment approach. This was the wrong way to go about it. So what we learned was deployment across regions was extremely hard. It's not supported in the UI. And once we did deploy it with Visual Studios, we had to go in and touch each logic app. That means open it up in the Visual Designer and save it again in order for that logic app to run in the new region. This was because internal API calls are hard-coded to a specific region, and when you open it up in the web designer, it will then update those API calls. So what we learned is a best practice here. So we need 1 subscription for each environment, and that would have solved all these problems, keep everything in the same region, and make sure we don't cross regions with our logic apps. So next we talk about our solution structure. This was one of the things I think we did well right out of the box. So we had a solution at the top level that mapped to a resource group. Then we created 1 project for each logic app that we wanted to build and deploy. Now, the Azure Resource Management templates do support multiple logic apps inside of one template, but it ended up looking a little hokey and seemed a little hard to deploy if we only wanted to deploy one of the logic apps. So we went with the overall approach of one-to-one at the project level. With this, we maintained 3 separate configuration files per logic app, one for each of our environments. We also created a virtual machine. See, I get to talk about my virtual machines again. We created a virtual machine for all our deployments. Our deployments were done by Johan's friend, Bruce. So we had a deployment guy who would fire up a virtual machine, and using this virtual machine, we can ensure a consistent version of the Azure SDK and the Azure PowerShell, and we can ensure all our file paths were correct, so we could ensure a smooth deployment. We scripted everything with PowerShell from a deployment of a logic app perspective, as well as from the deployment of the integration accounts. So quite literally, we could recreate our whole environment in 2 clicks, running 2 PowerShell scripts. When we did our development, we led with a web portal first approach. This meant we would build essentially a POC inside the web portal. Then we would recreate that down inside of Visual Studio. I always did that manually, quite frankly, because the ability to download it automatically didn't exist yet. But I tend to be a very stubborn developer when I'm doing development. So now that that feature is available, I'll probably still do it manually. So the flat file schema editor came out, 10 years ago? And I still build all my flat files by hand. So once I get kind of stuck doing something, I like to continue to do that. And something else to note is that the Visual Studio Designer lags behind the web portal by about 2 weeks. So let's take a look if we did want to download our logic apps from the web portal into Visual Studio. You would do that using the Cloud Explorer. You would go into the Cloud Explorer, log in with your credentials, you navigate to your subscription, find your resource group, and then find the logic app. You simply right-click on it and say Open in Logic App Editor. Then once it loads, you simply click Download. The next thing that kind of caught us a little off guard was the serverless platform. Now don't get me wrong, the serverless platform was amazing. We didn't have to think about where things ran. We didn't have to think about hosts and host instances. We just deployed code and it executed. But sometimes things would break by no fault of our own. And we do have to remember that the serverless platform is somebody else's platform. They have to do maintenance and deployments on their own. Every once in a while, something might go awry. So how many people here have had had 2 or more production support instances this month? Well, a couple. 2 or more this year, the past 6 months? Okay, a couple. So what we found so far since we went live is we've had 3 major production instances, or issues. The first one was when the client changed the schemas and everything went down. But then we had 2 others that were more platform-related problems that we had to reach out to Microsoft for support on. Now, the good thing here was I didn't have to call the IT guy in the corner. I didn't have to call our single infrastructure engineer. I had to call Microsoft, and it was Microsoft's problem to help us resolve that. So it made it nice. It made it so we didn't have to point fingers at our infrastructure folks and say, you guys broke something, you need to fix it. The CTO was in the corner pointing fingers at Microsoft, but everything was resolved. There was very little downtime, and we continued to move forward. It was a very minor impact to us because we were a batch process, so we could be down for several hours and not be impacted, which also was why we didn't take it as critically as we would have if it was a real-time process. So now let's move into phase 3. Let's talk about the tips. So how many people here have read or is going to read the Logic App documentation before you build your first Logic App? 1 person. Thank goodness. So 1 person is going to read the documentation. The documentation is phenomenal. It's some of the best I've seen. It outlines all the rules of the Logic App platform that you need to follow to build your Logic Apps and do cool integration stuff. But figuring most people like myself don't read that documentation, and personally, before I built some Logic Apps, the documentation didn't make as much sense to me as it did after I had the experience of kind of looking at some of the code and the JSON and fighting through some problems. But I do pull some things out directly from the documentation here, and it's definitely things that I wish I would have known about before I tried to take my first logic app to production. First off, don't be afraid of JSON. And what this means is I kind of expected working with logic apps, I'd be able to do everything in the web editor. I thought I'd never have to switch to this code view. It was just something cool that was there if I wanted to see what the code behind looked like. Well, it quickly turned that you still need to use the code view to do certain things. And when new features come up, a lot of times they come available in JSON first. You have to edit the JSON manually, and then they become available in the web editor. And then 2 weeks later, they're in Visual Studio. So I found I was spending more and more time actually in the code view than I kind of expected to be. And I found that I became very custom in the code view, where I would almost not necessarily prefer the code view, but I got very accustomed to making changes directly in the code view. I ended up spending about 25% of my time in the code view side of things. Now, the downside of this is you could very easily brick your logic app. And what this means is you switch to JSON and you can't get back. So that can happen for various reasons. One of them, so before I switched to code view, I always save my logic app. Sometimes I even check it into TFS if it's a major enough change to make sure I can always get that version back if I can't switch back out of JSON. So sometimes you can't switch back until all fields are validated. So what this means is even if you're not dealing with that specific element, there might be another element on another action that isn't complete yet, which was fine in the UI, but once you switch to JSON, it's now going to validate that field for you and won't let you switch back to the designer until you make that correction. The same is kind of true with saving logic apps as well. A validation process goes through, is ran before save, and you need to be in a certain state or it won't let you save it. So another thing is to make sure when you add a new action to your logic app, configure the whole thing beginning to end. I went through once and added about 5 actions, which was my flow end to end, and then configured a couple of them and tried to save, and that didn't work because all the actions weren't fully configured. And you also want to make sure that when you add a new action, you name it what you want to name it as soon as you add it. This way you can, that's because further shapes down that reference that action, use the name in that reference. So if you use variables, for example, from another action, it will put the name of the action and then question mark variable name. So it's hard to change the name of actions after you've used them in later shapes. The other thing that hit us pretty hard was Microsoft accounts. Now this has nothing to do with logic apps, but we found that having more than one Microsoft account that we used on a single dev box caused us all kinds of issues. So I would log in with my Hotmail account, my personal subscriptions, and then try to log into the client subscriptions, and it was not a pretty picture. So it's best to use one account on your development box if you can. And we found that we always had to access the Azure portal via Chrome Incognito windows. For whatever reason, that's still the only way today that I can access our client's portal. We found that if you get odd deployment results, so you're in Visual Studios, you do a deployment of your logic app, just doesn't look right, make sure you just close all your browser windows and try again. Sometimes those browser windows being open can impact things. There's something else that's kind of interesting that's out there, and it's called auto merge. So you want to try to avoid deploying from Visual Studio when you're in the designer of the logic app inside the web portal. If you try to do that, it will do something that's called auto merge, and you get very undesirable results most of the time. So it's a great feature. It does it to try to prevent you from overwriting code that somebody else is doing. So again, if you get it in the situation, close all your browser windows, deploy again using Visual Studio. Now let's talk about connections. So connections seem easy, right? You drag a SQL shape into your logic app, you configure your SQL connection, and you're good to go. We found it to be much more complex than that, and I'm going to try to sum it up as simply as possible. I've changed the slide about 7 times because every time I'm confused by it, so hopefully it's good now. So connections are generally defined at design time inside your logic app. The connections actually live at the resource group level. So even though you create the connection in your logic app, it is a first-class Azure artifact that lives outside of your logic app at the resource group level. So what this means is the last deployment, if you're deploying multiple logic apps, say via Visual Studio, the last deployment or the last update to that connection will win, which means it will define the values for your whole resource group. So let's take a look at what that means a little bit more. So here's what it looks like under API connections. To get to this, you just search for API connections inside your Azure portal. Here's all the connections that exist inside the Integrate 2017 resource group. I could come into here and I can make a change to any of these properties right here, and it will impact every single logic app that uses that connection. Now, here's a single logic app that lists the API connections that are used by just this logic app. If I go in here and make a change to the connections, this will impact this logic app and any other logic app in the region that uses this connection. And now here's what it looks like when I define variables inside of Visual Studio. Now, if I define variables here and do a deployment, it will use these variables for everyone in the resource group that uses that connection. So where we run into problems was we added a new logic app after we'd had a bunch running for a while, and then used the SQL connection, and it grabbed all these dev parameters and it put it in the config file, and we didn't notice that it set database name as a default parameter. So we went and deployed that to UAT, and it overrode all the connections with a different database name. So luckily we were able to catch it, and that's where we came up with some best practices around connections. So connections are, the way we did it is we defined connections in a single logic app, and everybody else referenced that connection by name only. So we knew that our top logic app called generate file was the one that held the reference for our main SQL connection. So anybody else that would use a SQL connection, we'd delete all the other parameters in the Azure on the template file and make sure it referenced it by name only. We also set it up so that we would have one connection per destination per resource group. So if everybody's connecting to the same SQL database, if there's no reason for them to have a different username or password or access anything different, everyone's going to share the same connection, and it's going to be used across the entire resource group. So next, let's talk about default retries. What we found out with default retries is we had sub-logic apps that we were calling. Inside the sub-logic apps, there was additional SQL logic, and then at the end, there was a step that was failing. And the additional SQL logic was writing just temporary log messages to a table, and every time it would fail, we would see 4 log messages written. And we're like, why are 4 log messages being written? Well, by default, the retry for every action is to retry 4 times over the span of 20 seconds each. Now you can change that, it's fully configurable at the per action level, and that can be set using a retry policy. It's quite simple, it just looks like it is here. You define the time and the count for the retries. We also found that when calling custom APIs, we had some custom APIs that we called, that we could control the retries ourselves based on the response code that we return to the logic app. So anything that is a 500 error or a 429 will automatically trigger a retry. So if we didn't want it to retry, we would return something else in the 400 range, knowing that now the logic app won't try to retry. For more information on this, you can see handling errors and exception in logic apps, which is an incredible read and very well documented document. So now we get into resource group level artifacts. So what do I mean by that? So when you add a function or an integration account to a logic app, it's a resource group level that you're using inside your logic app. It will create a parameter that looks like this, and you see it defines a default value. Can anybody see the issue in the default value? It has your subscription ID as part of that variable, which means if I don't change this value when I move to my next environment, it's still going to be pointing to the wrong subscription. So the good thing is, so we initially went and parameterized this, put this in our configuration files, but then that seemed to just get kind of messy. So we found out that there's a better way. So later on down, if you're in Visual Studio looking at your resource management template, later on down, it actually calls out integration account. By default, it is using the parameter, but if you change it to use the resource ID instead, making sure my name was the same, using the resource ID, then you don't have to provide a subscription ID, and you're all good to go. So by doing this, you can then go back and disable the variable that's above, remove it, and you don't have to worry about it again. For each loops. So for each loop seems simple. They were initially limited to 1,000, then it went to 5,000, and now it's at 100,000 loops. That should be more than enough to accommodate anyone's workload. You can see logic app limits and configuration for more information about overall limits across logic apps. But what we noticed for each loops is things were running out of order. So we had IDs in the messages we were processing, and they were being written to our SQL table out of order. So it turns out that by default, the for each loop runs concurrently multiple loops. I believe it runs 20 loops at a time. So if it's doing it to get faster processing through your for each loop, but not always the desired effect that you want. So if you want to change that, you would simply edit the JSON file as shown here, set it to sequential, and you're all good to go. You're now going to run in order singleton pattern through that for each loop. Next is recurrence singleton. So what this means is triggers that have a recurrence value, such as anything that is time-based. So you just simply have a recurrence trigger, set it to run every 5 minutes. Well, there may be times where if the other instance is still running, you don't want it to kick off a new instance of that same logic app. Well, that can be done, like we saw with the previous, via editing the JSON as well, and setting it to a single instance, as you see here. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is user permissions. So once you are running live in logic apps, you can change the user permissions of your production logic apps by going under Access Control AIM. And there's two different types of logic app roles that you could assign to users. First is the contributor, which is pretty much full access to update and run and view logic apps. Least permissions is the operator, where you don't have as much permissions. You can enable, disable, but you can see run history. Well, this is all great, but what we found was when I was a contributor to a logic app, and I would go in, I was trying to change the time frame on a recurrence, I kept getting an error on the connection saying I didn't have permission to change the connection. So even though I'm not changing any values with the connection, it wouldn't let me update the logic app. And do we remember where connections live? They live back at the resource group level. So we found that I also needed to be a contributor at the resource group level in order to make any changes to logic apps that used at least SQL connections, because that was what we were leveraging in that logic app. So I'm not sure if that's consistent across the board with all connections, but it's something to keep in mind when you're assigning least access rights to your logic apps. So let's talk about a summary of what we talked about. We looked at an analysis of when to use logic apps with integration accounts. We reviewed what I did wrong and right in my first logic app project. Then we stepped through tips on how to make your logic app design experience a little bit better. I think we're at break time, so if there's questions, just find me afterwards or shoot me an email. Remember, steven@stevenw.com. Thanks.